Hi, I want to spend a few minutes and show you how easy it is to get started using a new feature of WebSphere Extreme Scale called Extreme Scale Liberty Deployment, or XSLD for short. Now, XSLD provides extreme scale capabilities in an easy to use fashion, so it's very easy and painless to administer, manage, configure, and deploy enterprise data grids. The first thing to note is the installation process is done via the installation manager. The installation manager is very similar to all of the other installations you've done with WebSphere. So navigating through the installation process in terms of determining your application deployment paths, right? The first thing that you'll note in the installation is that the architecture selection is grayed out, and that's because we support the 64-bit version. So if you're not running on 64-bit architecture, you will not be able to continue the deployment. After selecting the paths where you want to install the software, the final page of the installation is really about configuring the XSLD cache member group itself. Now think of a cache member group almost like an appliance, right? So it's got a node that I'm running on. This VMware image is a node that I'm running on, and I want to be able to create that cache member group and add this node that has a fair amount of memory allocated to it to the cache member group. So what I'm seeing here in this is that the installation has detected that my node has 4 gig of memory available that I could use towards the cache and adding this member to the cache group. I do need to provide a name of a cache group, so the cache group 1 is fine. The default name of the member that I want to add is the name of the host, although I can change this to any name that I like. We also need to supply some security information. So a secret key is needed. The secret key is used when you are doing various administration activities on the cache group itself, such as adding new cache members or disjoining cache members from a group. You also will be required to put in an administrative password, where this is the password for the default and initial admin user ID that gets created during the installation process. So it'll create a user ID called XSadmin, and this is the password for that particular user. Now the password rules are pretty strict, and they're noted down here. So I'm going to go and type in a password for the secret key and the admin password. Note that they don't have to match, but in my case I'm going to make them the same. The last thing I want to note is the checkbox about starting the servers after the installation. So with this box checked, when the installation is done, all of the servers, JVMs, watchdog processes and everything will be started on your behalf, and so at the end of the installation you'll have a fully running enterprise cache group. So assuming I got my passwords correct, the installation will allow me to proceed to the next page. Now the installation is going to take a few minutes, but I also have another node where I have actually already installed a member, and this is the administrative console that's available to you once you do complete the installation. I can log into the administrative console using the default ID and the password that I created during the installation. The idea of the dashboard or this admin console is you get to be able to see the most common types of information you're going to need to administer the cache member and data grids. So what you'll notice is when I've just created the brand new install is I've created the cache group that has exactly one member in it, and my member has 2 containers. Each of these containers has 2 gig of memory, and my cache group is online. Right, so everything is running as expected. At the moment I have no data grids. I just have 4 gig of storage available to create grids, and within that 4 gig I can then start creating grids. The user that's available is the default XSadmin ID that got created during the installation, and that ID is in an administrator role or group, right? So you can then start adding additional users and groups such as if I need to create additional administrator user IDs and add them to the administrator group, I can do that. Or should I decide to want to create different groups and add users to different groups for access to the various data grids that I would create, I can do that as well. So the first thing I want to do after creating a cache member, a cache group with a member in it, is to create my very first grid. And you'll see how easy it is to use the administrative console to create a grid. There are a couple of different choices for grids. So if you want to cache application data, you can use a simple grid. If you are in a situation where you want to create a grid for caching HTTP session data, you could create a grid for that. And another template for dynamic caching. So if you're working with commerce, for example, you could use this as the cache replacement for commerce. The owner of this grid is XSadmin, the only ID I have available. At the time that I create the grid, I can enable security if I like. You can also update this later after the grid's created. I'm going to create the grid without security enabled at the moment. But it's easy enough to add the security to the grid later and using the admin console or the REST APIs. So it should be noted as this grid's being created that while I'm doing a lot of these capabilities from the admin console, the XSLD also provides operational REST APIs that you can use to access CRUD operations on the grid itself. So if you want to create elements or update, or view elements in the grid itself, you could do that. There's also an admin REST API where you can do all of the administrative capabilities that you could do in the admin console plus more. It should be noted that the admin console supports a subset of the capabilities that you could do using the REST APIs. So what you'll see in just a minute, I've actually created a grid, and XSadmin ID has full access to the grid. Once the grid's created, I can come in and actually edit the settings. So if I wanted to turn on security, I could do that at this time if I like, or changing the number of partitions and things like that. Notice that some of the changes to the grid will require a grid restart. You'll lose data. So for example, changing the number of partitions is something you probably want to get right probably the first time. There are some advanced settings for the grid, so you can manage your replicas, evictions, and actually limiting the size of the grid. So for example, I've got 4 gigabytes available for me in my cache member, but maybe I only want to allocate 250 megabytes for this particular grid. So I can go ahead and do that. So this will take just a second, but it'll update the grid with the right sizing of 250 megabytes, right? So while that's going, what I want to do is I want to show you a Java client. So once the grid is actually created, then it's just a matter of using your REST gateway or a simple client or a Java client to be able to access the grid. So I've created a little application that just loads a set of data into the grid and is run as a Java application. So this application will actually load about 20 megabytes of data, so not a lot, but it'll load the data into the cache and then read the cache back, all of the data back from the cache, just to validate that I can access all the elements of the cache, right? So here it's just loaded the cache, and then it's gone through and he has read the data back from the cache. So at this point you can see that my grid is operational, and I would be able to come in and look at some of the monitoring capabilities of that particular grid, such that I can see of the 250 megabytes that I've allocated to the grid, I've got 21 megabytes used. And you'll also see some of the information that's available in the charts in terms of response time, hit rates, and throughput through that particular grid. I can also go to the data tab and look at using regular expressions. I can look at the data that's in the grid. And here you'll see I've entered just a bunch of byte data into the grid itself, but you'll be able to see that information into the grid as well. Also with the cache members, I can look at the information related at the cache member level itself. So in the cache member, I have access to monitoring data as well. So if I look at the actual cache member, right, in my entire group, I have Of the 4 gig I've allocated, I've got 3.5 gig free, and I've got some amount of it being used by the JVMs that make up part of the containers. And in a few minutes, it might be too small to see, but in a few minutes, when this thing refreshes, you would actually see a little green sliver that starts making up the amount of space that's allocated towards the grids that you've created. Right. So it hasn't refreshed yet. Actually, this content refreshes about every 7 minutes, but you'd be able to see that when it does refresh. So that is just a short tour of how you can create a cache group and easily, just in a few minutes, create a brand new data grid and access that data grid from a Java client. Thank you.